Well, welcome to the Finish Line with Andy Ahern. Today we want to talk about the contract to purchase, part 1, 2, 3, and 4. Over the last 8 weeks, we've talked about how to sell a transportation company. We've talked how to set up a value, how to locate advisors, how to locate a qualified buyer. And then we discussed going through the due diligence process. And the due diligence process is a very difficult process. It's a very emotional process. I went into detail that there's peaks and valleys because as you're going through the due diligence process, every time you think you're going to cross the finish line, then something else happens. Well, now you come to the most important part of the transaction. That's the purchase agreement. And people many times take the purchase agreement too lightly, or in fact they don't choose the right advisors, and so instead of being deal makers, they become deal breakers. So I want to digress a little bit and get you to understand that the letter of intent is a non-binding contract subject to due diligence. Once the due diligence is completed and the buyer believes that he or she is ready to go forward to conclude the deal, they start with a purchase agreement. The purchase agreement is the definitive agreement of terms and conditions. So it has to be reviewed very carefully. You have to understand exactly what you're signing, but more importantly than that, you have to be careful that your advisors don't run up the meter. And you always have to be prepared. Because in the purchase agreement, there could be numerous components to the purchase agreement. There could be in the purchase agreement the base price, an earn-out provision. The earn-out provision, if you're a larger company, could be based upon EBITDA. If you're a smaller company, it could be based upon gross profit margins or net profits. And you have to understand that process. But most importantly, you have to advise your attorney not to run up the meter, because here's what happens. The buyer will initially construct a purchase agreement, and he sends it to the seller, who in turn turns it over to their attorney. The attorney then what we call redlines it. He goes through everything that they don't like. And then instead of calling up and discussing it with the buyer's attorney, they send it back. Then they send the red line version back to the buyer's attorney. The buyer attorney looks at it, discusses it with his client. Then they redline it again, what they're going to accept and what they're not going to accept. Then it goes back to the seller's attorney. Seller's attorney does it to the buyer's attorney. The buyer's attorney does it to the seller. Meanwhile, what you're doing is you're running up the meter. So rule number 1. As you're going through the contract to purchase, as you're working with the attorney, you want to know up front what is going to be the cost. And rule number 2 is recognize that the attorney says, I can't tell you what the actual cost is. So rule number 3 is you have to seal that attorney and get him or her to agree to charge you no more than X, and X better be appropriate. If you don't, you're going to end up with a horrendous legal bill, and you may not cross the finish line. The first thing you have to understand is there is no contract to purchase that's going to be utopia. There's going to be give and take on both sides. But until you understand the contract to purchase, until you've given your advisor instructions that we need to cross the finish line, you're not going to get the contract signed. So when you get the initial contract to purchase, if there's issues, you should advise your attorney to consult the issues with you. You make a determination as a seller what you can and cannot live with. Then the attorney must contact the opposing buyer's attorney instead of redlining it and see if they can come to a mutual agreement. This is the beginning of the process. There's other components to the purchase agreement that are just as important, even though they're not part of the agreement. And so next week we're going to talk about the employment agreement, and if you have a terminal property, the lease agreement. And it's very important that you understand that through this entire process, it's 1, very emotional, 2, it's going to be a roller coaster, but 3, if you follow the guidelines that I'm providing you today, you should be able to cross the finish line. Until next time, thank you for attending the podcast.